please welcome to the stage for me, Reid.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Good morning. I want to start this morning by recognizing Clint Taylor from Sentient Decision Science for his incredible work building a platform of technology that automates access to the human non-conscious. We're going to talk about platforms of technology today. When you build a platform and put it in the hands of brilliant people, amazing things happen. And the case studies that you're going to see today, I think, are a testament to that. So we're going to talk about automation and behavioral science. Automation is obviously a big trend in market research right now, but we can't simply accelerate the delivery of inadequate insights to our clients and expect to stay relevant in the boardroom. We need things that are faster and cheaper, but we also need things that are better. And so that's where the intersection of automation and behavioral science sits, at the center of the future of our industry. Automation, but automation of behavioral science. So there are a couple of key principles that we need to follow when we're automating behavioral science. This is more than just building cool tools. We're going to start by showing you some case studies in the realm of claims testing. And in order to do claims testing well, we don't want to reinvent the wheel for every single test. We want to ground those kinds of tests in sound psychological theory. And that's the first key principle that I want to focus on today. If we're going to automate behavioral science, let's not just create cool tools. Let's ground this in sound psychological theory so that what we build has legs for the long term. The claims testing you're going to see today is based in a model called the proportion of emotion model, published in 2008. And this is a model that combines emotion and reason into a single predictive algorithm that's actually more accurate in predicting behavior. It's not only theoretically based, but it's mathematically specified. So when you're doing claims testing, you often come across this objection from consumers. They say that advertising doesn't work on me. A product makes a claim, a brand makes a claim, and you don't believe it. But in reality, when a claim is made, it automatically activates associations in the mind, which, whether we're aware of it or not, become more accessible at the point of purchase and ultimately influence our decision. So even though, in this case, for example, Subaru is saying safety is their main message, and you say advertising doesn't work on you, and when it comes time to buy, safety has become more accessible to you in your mind and influences your decisions. So in the work that we did with Diageo, and Jason is going to take us through some meta-learnings from that work, we implicitly measure the impact of claims on purchase of different Diageo products. In this case, you can see Johnny Walker is presented as the product with no claim. And we measure at a baseline, what's the relative level of preference for this product? And we measure it rationally using choice-based conjoint, and we measure it with an emotional association exercise, which is implicit. And then we use that psychological model to combine those two data points mathematically to predict choice. Then we introduce a claim. For example, Johnny Walker is made with whiskies from the four corners of Scotland, and we look at the change in preference that's due simply to the introduction of that claim. So this is behaviorally derived psychological experimentation that includes both implicit and explicit conscious measurement. Jason is going to take us through several meta-learnings from this work that we did globally with Diageo. One of the great powers of building a platform for claims testing is that you learn not just from your single study, but when you use the same process over and over again, you gain more fundamental knowledge on the effects of claims. And Jason is going to take us through some of those.
Morning, everybody. I'm deeply regretting breaking my golden rule of ever speaking before noon. So big kudos to all of you for getting out of bed and getting here, because if you feel as bad as I do, then your dedication to the cause is admirable. So why am I here? It wasn't because Sentient bought me a very nice breakfast this morning, although they did. And it wasn't because they're putting my kids through college, because they aren't. But I'm here because I actually think what these guys are doing is really important in research. Most of the research that we do as marketing industry, and in fact most of the research that gets done in our field, or anything like our field, is terrible. Why is it terrible? Because we make 90-some, depending on the given context and the day, 90-some%, as we all know, of our decisions, particularly about things as unimportant as which brand to buy over another brand, subconsciously. We make those decisions without going through System 2, and we do that for lots of good biological reasons. And yet, the inverse is true of our research tools and techniques, our armory of research. 90-something% of it is all in System 2. We are using exactly the opposite tool to the one that we should be using to measure how people are actually going to make decisions. Everything about most research that we do starts off in the wrong place. Now, what I like about these guys and what I liked about them from day one was they're trying to break that paradigm. They're trying to find ways of measuring implicitly. They're trying to push the assessment of people's intentions and reactions back into System 1 as much as possible. Now, that's not easy, and this part of the industry is still in its infancy. I actually think that in 20 or 25 years' time, we'll look back on how we used to do research, if any of us are lucky enough to still be alive, and laugh, right? Because we'll have so much contempt for how we used to do it and how wrong it was. So this is important stuff. How do you take research out of System 2 and put it back into System 1 and test things implicitly? Why do I continue to believe in this? Because some of the stuff that we've done has actually shown us aha moments that we wouldn't have got if we'd just done them through typical explicit research methodologies. And that's true across a number of different projects that we've done, and this is one of them. So the Johnny Walker project that we did with Sentient. First of all, we've talked, and you will hear a lot about the benefits of automation in research. Really what automation is there to do is to speed up our learning and to allow us to scale learning. Because there are lots of different ways of ironing out the fluctuations and the inconsistencies in what people say. One of them is by having bigger and bigger samples. And that's why stuff like what Ehrenberg Bass do is so important, because they actually have scale samples across many countries, across a long period of time, and across multiple categories. And the same is true here of what these guys are doing with automating research. It's actually to get scale into your sample, because then you can generate behavioral insights that you can actually rely on. And if you don't have those, why bother doing the research in the first place? So here are some that we have learned in working with Sentient on this particular project, but also on other projects as well. So one of the ones is human beings like the best thing. It's a shorthand for what they could have versus other things. So if you want to consider what the claims might be for your product, for your service, for your business, for your brand, start there. Start trying to formulate an articulation of what is the best in that category. Now, you may not end up owning that, right? And we'll talk a bit about that later. But actually being the best at something, best in class, matters to people in terms of when they might make a choice. Again, these are things that normally, in the normal course of events, take place beneath the level of consciousness. But once you pull it out and look at it, it is an important thing. Another one is what level you go in at. So one of the things that we found across doing some of this research is that when you make a product claim that is too functional, it starts to cannibalize. We'll talk about what we mean by cannibalize in a minute. Whereas when you make a claim more at the level of a brand, it can actually have a halo effect. Now there's lots of caveats to that, which is how do you do it? Does it pay back to the brand that people already know? And all those kinds of good things. But fundamentally, that's the type of dynamic that we see happening. Focusing on the product rather than the company. A lot of us, client companies, tend to be quite inward-looking and quite self-referential. If you actually stop doing that and turn and look out at consumers instead of in at ourselves, what you actually find is that they're much more turned on when you talk about something to do with the product rather than something to do with the company that made it. And that's quite a hard habit to kick in some companies, but it's very important. And lastly, and in line with what we know from Ehrenberg about duplication of purchase and brands being substitutable, competitive claims might not always turn out to target the people that you want to target. We'll talk about that in a second as well. So I'll quickly go through each of these things. So it pays to be the best at something. So claims related to being the best or the favorite or the number one or any of those kinds of things do have a strong correlation to brand preference as measured in these things. So that's, again, can you always go out and grasp that and own it? Maybe, maybe not. Just include it in your thinking, right? So that you can actually have a benchmark to benchmark against. Doesn't matter whether it's true, doesn't matter whether you're legally allowed to say it or competitively allowed to say it, but make sure you've run the rule over it before you decide what you're doing. Brand messages have a tendency to halo, and product claims have a tendency to cannibalize. So when we talk about Johnnie Walker, and which we chose to do at times, refer to Scotch as whiskey, people don't know the difference between whiskey with an E and whiskey without an E. Strangely enough, why should they? So what we actually found was that when we referred to Johnnie Walker as whiskey, guess which brand got the benefit of that claim in that testing? Not Johnnie Walker. It's actually Jack Daniels. And that's not exactly good for us, right? So Jack Daniels is the thorn in our side. And to have tested a claim that if we had actually gone out with it might have benefited them in the market was a pretty good save, right? Because people do this all the time, right? Don't imagine that we don't. We do. So be very careful. Those product claims can actually attach to your biggest competitor or one of your stronger competitors if they reinforce something that people already think about that competitor. Focus on the product, not the company. I talked a bit about that earlier. This can be as simple as saying, this product is made in this type of distillery, rather than, we at Diageo make this product in this kind of distillery. Now, to our marketing ear, those things don't sound very different. But when you actually just plant those words in people's heads and see what happens, you actually find that when you talk about the product, that's what people are interested in, not the company that made it, which is probably just boring, right? It's probably not much more complicated than that. But there's a clear aha moment for us there, which is useful. And this is my favorite one, which is sometimes your claim that you've specifically gone out there to target another key competitor with actually doesn't target that competitor at all. And in some cases, it won't actually just not target that competitor. It will target another one entirely, which might be not useful for you if it's not a brand that you want to take share from or source business from. So if you get that wrong, you might end up undermining your entire business strategy. And even worse, you actually might find yourself slipping into the other thing that happens, which is if you also get it wrong and you reference the wrong competitor, you'll actually increase their propensity to be purchased rather than trying to target them. So first of all, who knew it was such a minefield, right? But I guess we sort of knew it was a minefield. But this really confirms if you ever need to take this up to the C-suite and say, this is difficult stuff and look what a good job we're doing, this all really contributes to that. So that's a bunch of the stuff that we learned. This stuff is really important. Go put some of those things into practice. I highly recommend it. Back to Aaron.
Thanks, Jason. I love that. In fact, those are insights with impact. You're actually doing something like that and changing your marketing communications based on those insights. Everybody familiar with this ad? Taking this from claims testing and putting into copy testing or advertising testing, again, if we start with a fundamental model of psychological theory on persuasive communication, we can build a platform that can give you meta insights as to why something works, as to the principles of what works within advertising. I'll give you an example here. You might be familiar with the attention, affect, memory, and desirability model of persuasive communication. That's the theoretical model of persuasion. But if you take your really good measurement techniques and you attach it to each step within that model, you have a potential platform for gaining more fundamental knowledge on how advertising works. And I'm going to show it to you relative to Kaepernick's ad for Nike.
If people say your dreams are crazy,
heat map's obviously eye tracking.
If they laugh at what you think you can do.
The line that's coming across the screen is the emotion that's
Good.
expressed on the face
Stay
while
that
they're
way.
watching the ad.
Because what
If it's below
non-believers
zero,
fail
it's
to
an average
understand
negative emotion.
is that calling a dream crazy is not an
If
insult.
it's above zero, it's an
It's a
average positive
compliment.
emotion. That's facial coding data.
Don't try to be the fastest runner in your school or the fastest in the world. Be the fastest ever. Don't picture yourself wearing OBJ's jersey. Picture OBJ wearing yours. Don't believe you have to be like anybody to be somebody. If you're born a refugee, don't let it stop you from playing for the national team. Don't become the best basketball player on the planet. Be bigger than basketball. Believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. When they talk about the greatest team, make sure it's your team. If you have only one hand, don't just watch football, play it at the highest level. And if you're a girl from Compton, become the greatest athlete ever. Yeah, that's more like it. So don't ask if your dreams are crazy. Ask if they're crazy enough.
Seems really good, right? There's a lot of green there. A couple of things that are really important here. The facial coding measures emotional engagement while people are watching the ad. That's an engagement metric. It's not necessarily an influence metric. We need to understand not only the emotion that's evoked while people are watching, but how much emotion, positive or negative emotion, is imbued on the brand following exposure. So we need both engagement and influence. You can see at the bottom of the graphic there, percentile ranks. Through the automation of behavioral science and using a sound psychological theory, we put every ad through that same model. We now have norms for performance on each of the elements of that psychological theory. So this ad is captivating from an attention standpoint. It's in the 96th percentile. People can't take their eyes off the screen. That's eye tracking data. But emotionally, this was a polarizing ad. Some people loved it, some people really hated it. It's only in the 34th percentile in terms of overall affect generated while watching. From an influence perspective, it's memorable, it's in the 50th percentile, but desirability, whether it actually moves the needle for the brand, it's only in the 38th percentile. Again, polarizing. Some people love this ad, some people really didn't like it. But by putting it within that platform, you gain meta-learnings about what's effective in advertising. And I'm going to take you through one example on those meta-learnings, then we'll open up for questions. If we're trying to increase memory in advertising, memory for our brand in advertising, making the product a central figure in the spot is critical. You may remember this spot from M&M where Danny DeVito actually played an M&M. This ad ranks in the 91st percentile in terms of memory, meaning people remember having seen an ad by M&M. Part of that reason that works is we have found by aggregating results across the database that there's a direct relationship between the time that a brand is on the screen and its ability to be encoded, the depth of encoding in memory. So here's an example from a single category. The x-axis is the time the brand appears on the screen, and the y-axis is the percentile rank of the ad and the memory score from the database. You can see there's a direct relationship between time on the screen and memory for the brand. Perhaps that's not a surprise, but here's some scientific evidence that for every 1 second that the brand appears on the screen, memory percentile rank increases by 1.5 points. So if you're doing your cuts of your ad and your brand is on the screen for 5 seconds, if you increase that to 15 seconds, you're going to go from an ad that's in the 30th percentile to one that's above average across all ads within your market. And this is category dependent. So when you have that built, you have norms for a category and general principles for advertising in general. We're going to end there with time and open up for any questions.